There's a habit you hate in yourself. You call it weak, maybe even sinful. Jung would call it something else. Compensation. When your persona refuses a part of you, the psyche doesn't lecture. It balances. It forces the missing piece back into your life as a vice, not to punish you, to keep you whole. In the next minutes, I'll show you 5 patterns that look like moral failure, but are actually messages from the shadow, and a 60-second self-test to find which one is running your life. If you recognize just 2, it's not willpower you need, it's integration. Before we dive in, if this resonates with you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This channel explores Jung's most profound discoveries, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. And if you've struggled with a behavior that feels impossible to stop, drop a comment right now with just the word signal. Let's see how many of us are hearing the same message from our shadows. Now, what if I told you that the very thing you've been trying to eliminate, suppress, or pray away is actually your psyche's desperate attempt to communicate something essential about who you really are? Jung discovered something that most people never learn. The unconscious doesn't operate on moral terms. It operates on wholeness. When you reject a part of yourself, when you build a persona that excludes certain qualities or needs or desires, your shadow doesn't just disappear into the darkness. It compensates. It finds a way back into your life, often through the behaviors you hate most. This is what Jung called the law of compensation, and it's one of the most misunderstood principles in all of psychology. Your psyche is a self-regulating system, much like your body maintains its temperature or your heartbeat. When one side becomes too dominant, the other side pushes back with equal force. Jung observed this pattern in every single person who walked into his practice, and he realized that what we call bad habits or destructive behaviors are often the shadow's only way of being heard when the conscious mind refuses to listen. The compensation mechanism works like this. Your persona, the mask you show the world, develops by excluding certain qualities. Maybe you learned early in life that being vulnerable gets you hurt, so you built a persona of total control and strength. Or perhaps you discovered that showing anger leads to rejection, so you created a persona of perpetual kindness and accommodation. These personas aren't lies exactly. They're just incomplete pictures of who you are, and the parts that got left out. The shadow, they don't just cease to exist. They go underground, waiting for their moment to emerge. Jung noticed that the longer a quality stays repressed in the shadow, the more primitive and compulsive its return becomes. It can't come back as a mature, integrated part of your personality because you've never given it a chance to develop consciously. Instead, it erupts as what looks like weakness or addiction or self-sabotage. The controlled person has mysterious episodes of chaos. The perpetually kind person has explosive rage they can't explain. The rational intellectual finds themselves in completely irrational situations. This isn't moral failure. It's the psyche's attempt at balance, at wholeness, at compensation. What makes this even more fascinating is Jung's discovery of enantiodromia, the principle that everything eventually turns into its opposite. Push too hard in one direction, and the psyche will eventually swing violently to the other extreme. The person who maintains rigid self-discipline for years suddenly finds themselves in the grip of behaviors they can't control. The individual who prides themselves on emotional strength has a breakdown that seems to come out of nowhere. These aren't random events. They're the natural result of one-sided development, of a persona that's become so inflated that the shadow has to take drastic measures to restore balance. Building on this understanding of compensation, let's look at the first pattern that appears when your shadow is trying to get your attention through what you think is a vice. You probably know this one intimately. that overwhelming need to control every detail of your life and the lives of people around you. On the surface, you tell yourself this is about being responsible, about making sure things don't fall apart. But Jung would ask you to look deeper, to see what this compulsive control is actually compensating for: your controlling behaviors, the constant planning, the inability to delegate, the anxiety when things don't go according to your precise expectations. These aren't character flaws. They're your shadow's response to a terrified part of you that feels fundamentally unsafe in the world. Somewhere in your development, you learned that letting go equals disaster. Maybe you grew up in chaos, and control became your survival mechanism. Maybe you experienced a traumatic loss of control, and swore it would never happen again. Or perhaps you absorbed the message that your worth depends on never making mistakes, never being caught unprepared, never showing vulnerability. The shadow that forms in these situations contains all the qualities your controlling persona rejects: spontaneity, trust, the ability to surrender, vulnerability, the acceptance of uncertainty. These qualities didn't disappear when you decided they were dangerous. They went into your unconscious, and now they're trying to force their way back into your life through the very behavior you hate. Your compulsive control is actually your shadow screaming that you need to learn how to let go, how to trust, how to be vulnerable. The tighter you grip, the more the shadow pushes, creating an exhausting cycle where control breeds more need for control. Jung observed that people with strong control complexes often have incredibly rich inner lives full of chaos, creativity, and spontaneity that never gets expressed. In dreams, these individuals frequently encounter wild, uncontrollable forces: floods, storms, wild animals, out-of-control vehicles. The unconscious is showing them what's missing, what needs to be integrated. But instead of recognizing these dreams as invitations to develop their capacity for surrender and flow, they often wake up even more determined to control their external world, completely missing the message. What's really happening underneath your control compulsion is that a wounded inner child, in Jungian terms this might be called a complex, is running your adult life. This part of you never learned that the world can be safe without constant vigilance, that other people can be trusted to handle their own responsibilities, that uncertainty isn't the same as danger. Your controlling behavior is this inner child's attempt to create the safety it never had. But paradoxically, the more you control, the more unsafe you feel, because control is exhausting and ultimately impossible. The shadow knows this. It's trying to show you through your very compulsion that there's another way to feel safe, through integration, through allowing the vulnerable, trusting parts of yourself to develop. The compensation shows up in other ways too. You might notice that despite all your control efforts, chaos keeps finding you. Your carefully planned events get disrupted. People around you become increasingly unpredictable. Technology fails at crucial moments. Jung would say this isn't bad luck, it's enantiodromia in action. Your psyche is creating external chaos to compensate for your rigid internal control, trying to force you to develop the flexibility and trust you've been refusing to cultivate. The universe, or more accurately, your own unconscious, conspires to teach you what you need to learn. If you're recognizing yourself in this pattern, just know that two more are coming that might hit even harder. And if this control pattern is already resonating, leave a comment with the word signal and the number 1. It helps me understand which patterns are most common in our community, and it might help you start acknowledging what your shadow has been trying to tell you. Following that pattern of control attempting to create false safety, let's look at the second signal your shadow sends, and this one manifests in behaviors around food, shopping, substances, or any form of consumption that feels compulsive and leaves you feeling worse afterward. You've probably beaten yourself up countless times for these behaviors, calling them lack of discipline or self-destruction. But Jung would invite you to see them through a completely different lens. These aren't moral failures. They're misdirected attempts to feed something that's starving inside you. In Jungian psychology, there's this concept of the anima in men and the animus in women, the contrasexual aspect of your psyche that holds qualities your conscious ego hasn't developed. But more broadly, Jung talked about how we all have needs for certain types of psychological nourishment, for beauty, for meaning, for soul, for depth, for connection, for creative expression. When your persona is built around productivity, efficiency, rationality, and achievement, as modern culture often demands, these softer, more mysterious needs get relegated to the shadow. They don't disappear. They just start screaming louder. Your compulsive eating, your shopping sprees, your substance use, these behaviors are your shadow's primitive attempt to fill a void that was never meant to be filled with material things. Jung observed that people who struggled with these patterns almost always had rich, neglected inner lives. They were often creative people who never made time for creativity, sensitive souls living in harsh environments, deeply feeling individuals in worlds that only valued thinking. The behavior isn't the problem. It's a symptom of soul starvation, of parts of you that have been exiled to the shadow and are now using the only language they know to demand attention. What makes this pattern so painful is that it creates a vicious cycle. You feel empty, so you consume. The consumption provides momentary relief, but no real nourishment, because you're trying to feed a psychological hunger with physical things. The emptiness returns, often intensified by shame about the behavior, so you consume again. Jung would say the shadow is getting exactly what it wants from this cycle, not the consumption itself, but your attention. Even negative attention is better than continued exile. Your self-judgment, your efforts to stop, your relapses, all of this keeps your focus on the shadow's message, even if you're not yet understanding what it's trying to say. The compensation mechanism here is fascinating. Jung noticed that the more people tried to live purely rational, controlled, productive lives, the more their shadows demanded experiences of the irrational, the pleasurable, the non-productive. The person who spends all day in their head finds themselves compulsively eating, trying to get back into their body. The individual who never allows themselves rest or pleasure develops shopping addictions, the shadow forcing them to at least acknowledge the existence of desire. The achievement-focused personality, who neglects all artistic or spiritual needs, finds themselves drawn to substances that artificially create feelings of transcendence or connection. Your consumption patterns often reveal exactly what your shadow needs. If you're compulsively eating, your shadow might be asking for more embodied presence, more sensory pleasure, more permission to have appetites and fulfill them without shame. If you're shopping compulsively, your shadow might be trying to tell you that you deserve beauty, that you're allowed to desire things, that your worth isn't only in what you produce, but also in what you appreciate. If you're using substances, your shadow might be desperately seeking transcendence, connection, or simply an escape from an ego that's become too rigid and demanding. Jung also observed that these consumption behaviors often have a sacred dimension that gets completely missed in conventional treatment approaches. The compulsive eater isn't just eating, they're performing an unconscious ritual, a communion of sorts, trying to take something from the outer world into themselves to fill the inner emptiness. The shopper isn't just acquiring objects, they're on a quest, searching for something that will finally feel like enough, like home, like completion. The substance user isn't just getting high, they're seeking an altered state, a doorway to parts of themselves that are otherwise inaccessible. What your shadow actually wants isn't the food or the purchases or the substances. It wants what those things symbolize and temporarily provide, nourishment for the neglected parts of your psyche. It wants you to feed your creativity, your need for beauty, your spiritual hunger, your desire for genuine connection, your body's need for pleasure and rest. The behavior is just the shadow's clumsy, desperate attempt to get these needs met when you refuse to meet them consciously and intentionally. Emerging from that pattern of trying to fill psychological voids with physical consumption, the third signal from your shadow often appears in your relationships, and this one is particularly painful because it makes you feel weak and dependent when you're actually experiencing something much more profound. You probably know this pattern if you find yourself unable to be alone, if you lose yourself completely in relationships, if you feel like you can't function without constant contact with someone, if you choose terrible partners repeatedly because being with someone, anyone, feels better than being alone. This isn't weakness or codependency in the way you've been taught to think about those terms. From Jung's perspective, this is your shadow using relationships to show you something essential about projection and the quest for wholeness. When you haven't integrated your shadow, when significant parts of your psyche remain unconscious, you can't experience yourself as whole. There's always this feeling that something is missing, that you're incomplete, and the psyche, in its drive toward wholeness, goes searching for that missing piece. It finds it in other people. Jung called this projection, and it's one of the most powerful forces in human psychology. You project your own shadow qualities onto others, and then become fascinated, obsessed, or addicted to those people, because being around them lets you experience the parts of yourself you've disowned. The person with unexpressed passion projects it onto a lover, and becomes addicted to that relationship, because it's the only place they allow themselves to feel alive. The individual with disowned strength projects it onto powerful figures, and becomes dependent on them, because they can't access their own power directly. What looks like relationship addiction is actually your shadow, trying to force you to recognize and reclaim these projected parts. The intensity of your attachment isn't really about the other person, though it certainly feels that way. It's about your desperate need to experience the wholeness that only comes when you integrate what you've projected. Jung observed that the people we can't live without are almost always carrying significant parts of our shadow, and the pain of separation isn't just loss, it's the pain of being separated from yourself. The compensation pattern here reveals itself in how your relationships evolve. You might notice that you're attracted to the same type of person repeatedly, or that your relationships follow similar patterns regardless of who your partner is. This isn't coincidence or bad luck. Your shadow is consistently seeking the same missing pieces, and it will keep creating similar situations until you finally recognize what needs to be integrated. The person who projects their aggression might consistently choose partners who act out anger for them. The individual who projects their vulnerability repeatedly falls for people who need rescuing. The pattern continues because the shadow hasn't gotten what it's really asking for, which isn't another relationship, but integration. Building on this understanding of projection, your relationship dependency also reveals something about your capacity for genuine intimacy versus fusion. Jung distinguished between these two states. Intimacy requires two whole, separate individuals choosing connection. Fusion happens when incomplete individuals try to merge into one unit to feel whole. When you can't be alone, when being single feels like death, when your identity dissolves in relationships, you're experiencing fusion. Your shadow is showing you through this painful pattern that you haven't yet developed the capacity to relate as a whole person. The suffering in these relationship patterns is immense, and if you're living this, I want you to know that your pain is real and valid even as we're reframing what it means. The desperation you feel, the terror of abandonment, the way you lose yourself in relationship after relationship, this isn't character weakness. It's your psyche's dramatic attempt to push you toward individuation, toward becoming whole enough to relate intimately without losing yourself. Every painful relationship, every devastating breakup, every moment of desperate clinging is your shadow trying to teach you that what you're searching for in others already exists inside you, waiting to be claimed. Jung noticed that people caught in this pattern often have incredibly rich inner lives that they never fully inhabit. They might be creative, passionate, strong, wise, or nurturing in their depths, but they've learned to only experience these qualities through others. The work isn't to stop wanting relationships, it's to stop needing them as the only way to experience your own completeness. Your shadow is using your relationship pain to force you toward this realization, and every time you can't make it alone, every time you jump into another unhealthy attachment, it's trying to show you what still needs to be integrated. And if you're recognizing yourself in multiple patterns now, that's actually a good sign. It means your consciousness is expanding, and you're starting to see the shadow's messages more clearly. Drop a comment with signal and the number that resonates most so far, and if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because the next pattern might be the one that finally makes everything click. Following that pattern of seeking yourself through others, the fourth signal from your shadow appears in a behavior that might seem contradictory to everything we've discussed so far: chronic procrastination, avoidance, and escape. You probably know this pattern intimately if you find yourself constantly putting off important tasks, disappearing into distractions, feeling paralyzed when you should be moving forward, or creating elaborate fantasies while your real life remains stagnant. This isn't laziness or lack of discipline, it's your shadow protecting you from something much more terrifying than failure. Jung discovered that procrastination and avoidance often mask significant creative or aggressive energy that's been exiled to the shadow. When you were young, you might have learned that your creativity was impractical, selfish, or threatening to others. Or perhaps you discovered that your assertiveness, your anger, your competitive drive, your ambition, these qualities led to punishment or rejection. So you pushed them into the shadow, and now they've turned into their most primitive form, pure avoidance. Your shadow is refusing to engage with a world that doesn't welcome the fullness of who you are. What makes this pattern so confusing is that you often know exactly what you should be doing. You can see the path forward clearly. You understand the consequences of continued avoidance, but somehow you just can't make yourself move. Jung would say this paralysis is actually a profound statement from your shadow. It's saying that the life you're avoiding isn't worth living, because it doesn't include the parts of you that have been rejected. Your procrastination is a sit-down strike, a refusal to participate in a life that requires you to remain incomplete. The compensation mechanism here operates through what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to create a third option when two opposites are in conflict. Your conscious ego wants to achieve, produce, succeed, and meet expectations. Your shadow contains all the parts that don't fit that program: the rebel, the artist, the one who wants to destroy and rebuild, the part that refuses to play by rules it didn't make. Instead of integrating these opposites, you end up paralyzed, unable to move in either direction. The procrastination is your psyche's way of forcing a standstill until you're willing to find a path that honors both sides. Jung observed that chronic procrastinators often have incredibly vivid fantasy lives. While your external life stagnates, your inner world is rich with images of what could be, alternate versions of yourself, adventures you'll never take, creations you'll never manifest. This isn't escapism in the simple sense. It's your shadow showing you what wants to live, what needs to be brought into reality. The gap between your fantasy life and your real life is the measure of how much creative energy is trapped in your shadow, how much of yourself you're refusing to embody. Your avoidance patterns also reveal exactly what your shadow is protecting you from. If you procrastinate on creative projects, your shadow might be protecting you from the vulnerability of being truly seen. If you avoid assertive action in your career, your shadow might be protecting you from the responsibility and visibility that comes with success. If you escape into substances or distractions, your shadow might be protecting you from the pain of facing how much of your life doesn't align with who you really are. The behavior isn't the enemy. It's a guardian, and it won't let you pass until you're ready to honor what it's protecting. The pattern intensifies through a mechanism Jung identified clearly. The longer you avoid, the more frightening the avoided task becomes, not because the task itself is getting harder, but because the energy behind it is building up in the shadow. That creative project you've been putting off for years isn't just a project anymore. It's become loaded with all your hopes, fears, and disowned creative power. That confrontation you've been avoiding isn't just a conversation. It's become the symbol of every time you failed to stand up for yourself. Your shadow has turned these avoided tasks into monsters because it's trying to show you how much power is trapped in your refusal to act. What your shadow actually wants isn't for you to just push through and force yourself to be productive. It wants you to examine what you're being productive for, whose rules you're following, what parts of yourself are being excluded from the life you're trying to live. Your procrastination is asking you to rebuild your life around a fuller expression of who you are, including the creative, aggressive, rebellious, or unconventional parts that don't fit the program you inherited or constructed. The paralysis lifts when you find a way forward that includes rather than excludes your shadow. Building on these patterns of the shadow demanding inclusion, the fifth signal is perhaps the most invisible because it looks like success. You might pride yourself on being the good person, the reliable one, the one who never causes problems, who always meets expectations, who maintains perfect composure. From the outside, you look like you've got everything together. But inside, you're exhausted, resentful, and increasingly aware of a pressure building that terrifies you. This isn't virtue, it's your shadow preparing for enantiodromia, the inevitable swing to the opposite extreme. Jung was particularly concerned about people with overly developed personas because he knew what was waiting in their shadows. When you build an identity around being perpetually kind, your shadow fills with rage. When you pride yourself on total rationality, your shadow becomes wildly emotional. When you maintain perfect self-control, your shadow contains chaos. The more one-sided your persona, the more dangerous your shadow becomes, not because there's something wrong with you, but because the psyche's demand for balance becomes increasingly desperate. Your perfectionistic persona serves several functions that your conscious mind probably isn't aware of. First, it protects you from rejection by never giving anyone a reason to criticize or abandon you. Second, it allows you to feel superior to messier, more flawed humans, while avoiding the vulnerability of being genuinely seen. Third, it keeps you so busy maintaining the image that you never have to face the parts of yourself you've rejected. Jung would say this isn't strength, it's sophisticated avoidance, and your shadow is getting tired of it. The compensation shows up in fascinating ways. You might have intrusive thoughts that horrify you, sudden urges to do something completely out of character, fantasies that seem to contradict everything you stand for. These aren't signs that you're secretly a bad person. They're your shadow trying to show you what's missing from your conscious personality. The perpetually kind person fantasizes about telling people off because their shadow contains legitimate anger that needs expression. The totally controlled individual has impulses toward wild abandon because their shadow is suffocating under all that discipline. Jung observed that people with perfect personas often experience dramatic shadow eruptions that seem to come from nowhere. The person who never drinks suddenly has a problem with alcohol. The individual who never raised their voice has an explosive rage incident. The one who seems so stable has a breakdown or affair that shocks everyone who knows them. These aren't random events. They're enantiodromia, the psyche's emergency intervention. When compensation through smaller signals has failed, your shadow will be heard one way or another, and the longer you maintain a one-sided persona, the more dramatic its eventual emergence will be. What makes this pattern particularly painful is the shame that comes with it. When your shadow finally breaks through your perfect persona, you don't just feel like you made a mistake. You feel like your entire identity was a lie, like you've been exposed as a fraud. But Jung would say, the lie wasn't the shadow behavior. The lie was the belief that you could be whole, while excluding so much of your human complexity. Your mistakes aren't exposing your true badness. They're exposing the unsustainability of your persona. And that's actually a gift, though it doesn't feel like one at the time. Your shadow beneath the perfect persona is often where your aliveness lives. The messiness, the imperfection, the parts of you that don't meet standards. These are often the most authentic, creative, and truly human aspects of your psyche. When you maintain such a tight grip on your persona, you're not just suppressing bad qualities. You're suppressing vitality, spontaneity, genuine emotion, and real connection. Your shadow knows this, and it's using your hatred of your imperfect behaviors to try to show you that perfection isn't the goal, wholeness is. Now that you've heard all 5 patterns, let's do something practical. Take 60 seconds right now for a self-test that will show you which pattern is most active in your psyche. I'm going to give you 5 statements. Count how many feel viscerally true for you, not intellectually true but felt in your body. Number 1. I feel anxious when I'm not in control of outcomes, or when plans change unexpectedly. Number 2. I use food, shopping, or substances to feel better, and I often feel worse afterward, but can't seem to stop. Number 3. I struggle to be alone, and feel like I lose myself in relationships, or can't function without constant connection. Number 4. I procrastinate on important things, especially creative or assertive actions, and feel paralyzed about moving forward. Number 5. I maintain a perfect image, and people see me as having it together, but inside I'm exhausted and terrified of being exposed or making mistakes. If you felt 2 or more of these in your body, your shadow is sending you signals through compensation. This isn't weakness or moral failure. This is your psyche trying desperately to move you toward wholeness. And the beautiful thing about understanding this is that once you see these behaviors as messages rather than flaws, everything changes about how you work with them. Integration is the answer Jung offered, not elimination or suppression, but integration. And there's a simple 3-day practice that can begin this process. This isn't about fixing yourself, it's about befriending your shadow and giving it a conscious role in your life, instead of forcing it to act out destructively. Day 1 is about naming. Choose the pattern that resonates most, and the next time it shows up, instead of judging yourself or trying to stop it, pause and write 3 sentences in a journal. What triggered this behavior? What emotion came right before the urge? What opposite quality or need might this be compensating for? This simple act of conscious attention begins to transform the behavior. From compulsion to communication, your shadow has been screaming to be heard. The moment you start listening, its tactics can become less desperate. Day 2 is about dialogue. Set aside 7 minutes for what Jung called active imagination. Close your eyes, take a few breaths, and imagine your shadow as a figure. It might appear as a person, an animal, a symbol, whatever emerges. Ask it one simple question. What do you need from me? Then listen. Don't judge what comes up. Don't edit it. Just receive whatever images, words, or feelings arise. Your shadow has been trying to tell you something through these behaviors. Now you're finally asking directly. Write down what you receive, even if it seems strange or uncomfortable. Day 3 is about embodiment. Choose one small action that honors what your shadow communicated. If your shadow needs spontaneity, do one unplanned thing today. If it needs rest, take 15 minutes to do absolutely nothing. If it needs expression, speak one truth you've been holding back. If it needs play, engage in one activity purely for pleasure. This doesn't have to be dramatic. Small actions that acknowledge your shadow's needs begin to reduce its desperate grip on your behavior. Then add a 90-second somatic anchor practice. Stand in a power posture, feet wide, arms up or hands on hips, and breathe using a 4 count in and 6 count out for 90 seconds. This physiologically resets your nervous system and creates a felt sense of integration between opposing forces in your body. Do this before any situation where your shadow pattern typically emerges. You're teaching your body that you can hold complexity, that you don't have to choose between persona and shadow but can contain both. The goal isn't to eliminate your behaviors, it's to understand what they're trying to tell you, and to meet those needs consciously instead of compulsively. Your control issues might soften when you practice small acts of surrender. Your consumption patterns might ease when you feed your soul directly through creativity or spiritual practice. Your relationship dependency might loosen as you reclaim your projections and develop a relationship with yourself. Your procrastination might dissolve when you align your actions with your authentic desires rather than inherited expectations. Your perfect persona might relax when you practice showing up as imperfectly human. Jung's vision of individuation isn't about becoming perfect, it's about becoming whole, and wholeness requires including the shadow, giving it a seat at the table, learning its language, and honoring its needs before it has to resort to the desperate tactics we've been calling vices. Your so-called bad habits are actually breadcrumbs leading you back to the parts of yourself you've been missing. They're signals, not sins, and when you learn to read them correctly, they become some of your most powerful allies in the journey toward becoming who you truly are. If this video changed how you see yourself, if you're starting to understand your behaviors as messages instead of failures, I need you to do 3 things right now. First, smash that like button so this reaches more people who need to hear it. Second, subscribe and hit the notification bell, because next week's video is about projection in long-term relationships, and it's the natural continuation of what we've uncovered today. Third, comment with just 2 words signal, and then the number of the pattern that hit hardest. Was it 1 for control, 2 for consumption, 3 for relationships, 4 for procrastination, or 5 for the perfect persona? Your comment helps build our community and helps me understand what content serves you most. And remember, Jung spent his entire life studying the shadow, and his conclusion was always the same. We don't become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The work is hard, but the reward is yourself, whole, integrated, and finally free from the war between who you pretend to be and who you actually are. Your vices aren't the problem, they're the solution trying to emerge. The question is, are you finally ready to listen?